Yeah, they're single-family homes or some lots. Kind of pricey.
Everything has got price. Looks similar to.
I call this meeting to order. We do have a quorum here, and I don't know, Mayor Irwin and Councilor Heisler were planning to try to join us. Are they on, or?
It doesn't sound like they're on yet. Oh, taper's on.
Okay, all right.
The mayor and I are here together.
Okay. All right, they with Keith Johnson, our town manager, have been down at a state wildland urban interface conference. So would you please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance and then remain standing for the invocation. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Tony Alba will offer invocation.
If you would all please bow your heads. Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us together this evening as we gather to consider matters of great importance to our community. We ask your blessing on the members of our town council and staff who are with us tonight, both in person and remotely. We ask that you watch over those who will be returning to our community tonight and tomorrow, and we pray for their safe return. We also ask you to bless our community members, our educators, and our business owners who work so hard every day to provide for the good of our community. We give thanks to our law enforcement personnel, firefighters, first responders, and healthcare workers who work every day to keep our citizens safe and secure, and we ask you to bless them tonight and always. Finally, as we celebrate this season of Christmas, we ask your special blessing for those in our community who are suffering or facing difficult times, and we pray that you might grant them peace and comfort. We ask these blessings in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Tony. Just a reminder also, please silence your cell phone if you haven't already. Next on the agenda is call to the public. This is a business meeting of the town council. The town values and welcomes public input. Please address the council as a whole and not individual council members. Do not address staff or members of the audience. Council action on items brought up in call to the public is limited by the open meeting law. The council may direct staff to study the matter and reschedule for further consideration at a later date. Items on the agenda will not be heard or discussed in call to the public. Individuals are limited to 3 minutes. We do have one, Mike Muffenbeyer wants to speak to us. Go ahead and take the stand, Mike.
Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of the council, staff, neighbors, and friends. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce for Pinetop-Lakeside. I'm thrilled to share some updates that reflect the continued growth and evolution of our chamber, as well as our commitment to supporting the local business community. First, we are pleased to announce the addition of 2 new voting board members, Bridget Wood and Mariah Comer. Bridget and Mariah bring fresh perspectives and extensive experience that will undoubtedly enhance our leadership. They replace David Bianco, who recently accepted an exciting new position in Oklahoma, and Jay Zucker, who stepped aside after taking on a role with the Arizona Gaming Commission. We are grateful to David and Jay for their service and wish them both the very best in their new endeavors. Additionally, we are excited to welcome Sammy Stevenson as our new Communications Secretary. Sammy will be taking the lead on managing our social media platforms, maintaining the Chamber's website, and addressing other key communications needs. Her expertise will ensure that we stay connected and engaged with our members and the broader community. Our recent members' meetings have been a testament to the strength of our network. On Tuesday evening, we were honored to host Todd Clark of Sunrise Ski Resort, who shared valuable insights about their operations and plans. Last month, we highlighted Marilyn Mott from the Better Business Bureau, whose presentation on business ethics and community collaboration was exceptionally well received. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank the Chamber members for their support of our meetings by hosting our networking events and providing door prizes for our meetings. We are grateful for all of their giving spirit. As we enter the renewals period, our focus is not only on retaining our current members, but also growing our membership in 2025. We are working diligently to enhance the benefits we provide to renewing businesses and attract new members who can contribute and benefit from our collective efforts. Finally, we want to express our heartfelt gratitude to the Council and the entire community for their unwavering support. Your partnership is essential to our mission of fostering a thriving business environment, and we look forward to continuing to work together to achieve shared success. As we enter the holiday season, I'll show you the very best for a healthy, happy holiday season. Look forward to seeing many of you at the Mayor's tree lighting tomorrow evening, and I hope you all have a blessed holiday season. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
We'll now go to item C, the consent agenda. All items listed in the consent agenda are considered routine matters and will be enacted by one motion of the council. There will be no separate discussion of these items unless a member of town council requests that an item or items be removed for discussion. Council members may ask questions without removal of the item from the consent agenda. Items removed from the consent agenda are considered in their normal sequence as listed on the agenda unless called out of sequence. We have one item on the consent agenda tonight, item C1, approval of the minutes of the Town Council regular meeting held on November 21st, 2024. Are there any questions or corrections to the minutes?
I move that we approve the consent agenda as presented.
Second?
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please raise the right hand. Okay, that's everyone here. Mayor Irwin and Council Member Heisler.
Mayor Irwin, are you still there?
We must have dropped. Okay. All right.
Sorry, we're here.
We're here. We vote aye.
Aye.
Okay. That's unanimous then. Thank you. Next, we'll go to item D, which is business before the council. Public comment will be taken at the beginning of each agenda item after the subject has been announced by the mayor and explained by staff. Any citizen who wishes may speak one time for 5 minutes on each agenda item before or after council discussion. Questions from council members, however, may be directed to staff or a member of the public through the mayor at any time. We only have one item on the tonight in the business before the council, and that's D1, presentation of the solid waste feasibility study performed by Burns and McDonnell. And I don't have anybody who wanted to speak here, right? We don't have any cards. Okay, nobody from the public.
No members of the public, no.
All right, let me turn the time then over to Director Rodoff to introduce the presenter.
Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and Council. I believe it was at our budget meetings last March that we started talking about the feasibility of different options for trash collection within the town. In last summer, I believe it was in July, we met with personnel from Burns and McDonnell, and we have a contract with them, and they have created this really comprehensive study for us to go through tonight and talk about different options. Tonight we have with us Jack Simmons and also his associate Philip Kramer, who will be joining us by Zoom. So Jack, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of council. My name is Jack Simmons. I'm a project manager with Burns & McDonnell. I'm joined today with my coworker in the cloud, and his name is Philip Kramer, and he is the economic analyst for our firm. So he and I both were very integral in this study, and we wanted to present it tonight. As Mr. Rodolph had explained, this study, the town engaged Burns & McDonnell to conduct this study to evaluate how to most efficiently and effectively collect the residential trash from the town. So that was our mission, and we'll jump right into it to talk about how this project was outlined, and this will also double as how this presentation is outlined. So you can see on the board here, or on the slides, phase one was where we had the initial kickoff with the town. So we spoke with members of the Public Works Department here. They were very, very helpful, and we had a kickoff meeting with them, which essentially aligned our scope of work with their expectations and vice versa. So by doing that, we sent out what we call a request for information to obtain the critical foundational information we need for this study. And then from there, we were able to move into phase two. As Mr. Rodolph had said, that Philip Kramer and I came out here in July 31st and August 1st to meet with the Public Works Department. We had extensive interviews with them, with private waste haulers, with Public Works staff, such as fleet maintenance, and then we also toured the town to see the current system that you all are operating under right now for solid waste collection. From there, we obtained a lot more information through discussions with Public Works Department staff. We then went into data analysis, where we jumped into phase three. So phase three was essentially the number crunching. We had all of your financials that were relevant to this project. We had metrics on logistics. We were able to put all those into our proprietary models, such as routing models and cost of service models, so that we could come up with the feasibility of each one of these collection systems. And these collection systems, just so you all are aware, there's three of them. There's what we're calling the current system, or the status quo. And so as we know, what we refer to it internally at Burns & Mac as open market. And that is essentially any resident can call up a number of waste haulers that service that area and request service. The second option that we considered is contracted services, town contracted services, which is essentially putting out an RFP or a bid process to have a contractor bid for the collection, or for the exclusive right to collect the residential town trash. And then the third option was for the town to provide those services. And there is a combination option, which is the fourth, which we can touch on, but it's really not highlighted since those are the primary ones. And as we'll see, that the combo can happen, and there's multiple avenues to do so. So we're going to focus on those three. So then we have phase four. That's where we're going to talk about the business strategies and recommendations. So this section is a comprehensive analysis of each one of these systems as it relates to certain topics that the town felt were important and that we feel are important for this kind of study. We graded those, or we scored those, and then from there we made recommendations. And then, of course, this is phase five, which is the presentation to y'all tonight. So we'll jump into what phase two focused on. So as mentioned, when my coworker and I came here this summer, we toured the town and we talked with the Public Works Department extensively. We understood the responsibilities of the Public Works Department. I'll breeze through this since y'all are the town and y'all understand your own department, but ultimately we digested that they manage the collection center out there. They perform the maintenance of the vehicle fleet. They ultimately maintain and construct roads, selected roads. They have the snowplow services route, which is actually very critical for the GIS component of routing of solid waste vehicles. So that was very interesting to hear about. And then, of course, they manage town parks and recreational areas. The private sector, what their role in the community looks like, is that they provide the solid waste collection and disposal right now in this open market. And that can be running around as haulers to collect the trash. That can be the transfer stations up the street near Taylor. And that can be the landfills in the nearby areas. And then also the private sector does control the utilities here. And that's water, sewer, and, as we said, solid waste. And they also will, as part of that, they have the billing and customer service part of that responsibility. So then we focused in on the solid waste collection center operations, which is critical to the town's operation and is the experience of the town, the town's experience with solid waste to this point. So you can see here, simply put, hours of operation. Staffing, we have one manager, one full-time worker, and one part-time worker listed. And they ultimately support the Public Works Administration, and they have two full-time mechanics, which also are split between, to our understanding, with other town services and other town departments. For equipment, one roll-off truck, one backhoe, and that's used for compaction as well as moving of material. And then most importantly, the disposal and processing facilities. So we learned that all of those 20 and 40 cubic yard containers that are out there in the collection center, which we'll show in a second an aerial of that collection center so you can get a better idea of what it looks like. All of those go to multiple locations. It almost seems like each one goes to a different location, which does provide some strain on what we call transportation and disposal, T&D. One of the disposal facilities being Blue Hills, which is clear out in St. John's. So the great thing about the collection center is it does provide a convenient location for citizens to dispose of trash, and it also provides a convenient option for recycling of material. As we know, the collection center has been applauded by ADEQ, the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, and other towns and cities in Arizona have also tried to mimic this operation because it's so successful. It also allows the opportunity for residents to not engage in a contract with a private hauler and to simply utilize the collection center as their waste disposal. This does help too because this is a second home community. So as mentioned, here's the collection center operations slide, which is you can see on the left side of the slide, just a simple aerial of the collection center. We have the admin building or the public works building. We have the fleet maintenance building. And of course, in the lower right, where you see all the diagonal containers, that's where the collection center is. We see that the collection center, based on public works department staff estimates, let's call it, 60 to 85 residents a day will come through that center. They, of course, generate fees or revenues on the front end, and then from there, that material can be placed into the individual containers. It can be set aside, such as mattresses, bikes, tires, pallets, and we see that the town has done an excellent job of being able to determine whether an item has value to the town residents or if it needs to go for disposal. So for example, if a bicycle comes through, the town may consider that as a donation or some sort of other revenue stream. So as you see, as mentioned, they do handle the household MSW, which we call as abbreviated for municipal solid waste. That's essentially residential trash. And then of course, construction debris and the recyclables. All right, so this is where the meat of the study starts, is when we start to look into what the current system is looking like right now. So these were photos that my coworker and I took as we drove around your town. And you can see that on the upper left-hand side there, were the multiple carts. These are just a few of the carts that we were able to take pictures of while we drove around town. As you can see, there's multiple haulers listed on the sides of these carts, some of which, to our understanding, have been acquired by other haulers, but the carts still are out there. So we can get into the impacts of that next. Another picture I have there is the town has dumpsters throughout the town for residential use. This was a single street right here. We had 2 dumpsters in a row. It can impact aesthetics, of course, and we'll talk about that here shortly. So ultimately, the residents have the choice, and the HOAs have a choice to contract with their individual haulers, and you can have setups like this where multiple households can be using single dumpsters. I apologize for the small font here, so bear with me as I just read through it as quickly as possible. But aesthetically, so you have an open market. As you just saw, the aesthetics will negatively impact public perception. You have multiple cans on a road that are all multiple colors, sizes, shapes, and everything. A lot of residents like to see a uniform collection system, essentially, when they enter a town. An organized system would do that. A commitment, so the town, of course, has significantly less responsibility under the status quo of the current operation. And their responsibility primarily comes from maintaining the streets that get run over 4 to 5 times a week by different haulers as they service. Of course, if you go organized system, the town involvement will ramp up. We'll get into that further into this presentation on where that town involvement is going to be the most dedicated, whether it's town-provided services, of course, or contracted services. As far as control goes, again, town's control right now under the current system is low to minimal, or I'm sorry, minimal to none. And then under the organized system, it would be ramped up significantly. Cost, so right now the town benefits from the collection center, from revenues there. And as far as cost goes, it's mainly an expense for roads and fielding complaints from residents that may not understand that the town isn't providing those services. Of course, for costs, there's a lot of capital investments that are going to have to be made if the town goes into it. If they go into an RFP setup, that is a whole another bucket of costs that will have to be considered. So costs will ramp up with the other options. As far as environmental, some of the big things here, to look at it simplistically, you have, let's say there's a single street and you have 5 different cans or carts and haulers service those. You could have a single truck, a single collection vehicle, which are the large, bulky, we call them ASLs, automated side loaders, go up and down that street every day of the week. And we all know what that's like at 7 a.m. when it's picking up your cart and shaking the heck out of it, and it wakes you up and everybody else up. So you have that all week long. With an organized system, what we like to do is we'll see that you have a single day set out, and that could be if there's multiple services. Of course, this study focused on trash, but other scenarios could be trash recycling, bulk, stuff like that, and you can have a single day set up for your residents. So for safety, these trucks, the ASLs, let's call them, and rear loaders, all these collection trucks, they're made to be as safe as possible, but they are still giant, clunky machines. And so they have cameras, they have backup alarms, they have everything, but we still see incidents day in and day out. In fact, we were talking to a client not too long ago, and they had a fatality. And that was because a collection truck hit a student. And so it happens. That's the nature of the industry. This industry is ranked notoriously in some of the highest safety incidents every year nationally. And that's, this industry is really working to drive that down. So of course, safety, you'll have less vehicles on the road. You'll have less air emissions because you'll just have less vehicles on the road essentially, and you'll have less wear and tear on the roads as well. So the next one is the service levels. As we know right now, you have multiple haulers. Each one's going to have their own level of customer service. That may vary significantly. And again, residents may be confused that the town does not provide that, and they'll end up going through you as well, and it can lead to inefficiencies. Service levels under an organized system, I'll keep it brief. You all will have control over that, or the contractor will be able to work with you for that. And then, of course, street maintenance. Multiple trucks going up and down every road beats the roads up, whereas once a week, of course, it'll be less wear and tear. So thank you for bearing with me through that slide. All right, so now we wanted to evaluate the contracted collection service options. And so this was the evaluation of private haulers' interest and their pricing for servicing the town if the town were to go that route. So like I mentioned, when my coworker and I were here in town, and we interviewed 3 haulers that service this town. For confidentiality reasons, we aggregated all their data, and we're not going to mention any names. So we interviewed them, and we asked them a series of about 15 questions, if I'm not mistaken. And one of them was essentially, what are you currently charging the residents of Pinetop-Lakeside? The numbers that we received on an aggregated basis was anywhere from $20 to $27 per household per month. And it's pretty critical to understand per household per month. That's what we're going to use for all of our numbers going forward. And of course, and just to make the differentiation there, households could, I believe in Pinetop-Lakeside, our assumption was between 1.9 and 2.3, 2.4 people per household. We'll get into that later, but just for reference for now. Now, just keep in mind, please, that $20 minimum, the hauler did inform us that is expected to increase to $23. So for purposes of this, you can see that blue bar in that graph over there for the contracted services. We're seeing at $23 to $27 is current rates in the town today, based on those 3 haulers' interviews. They did also, like I mentioned, they all expressed interest in bidding on an RFP if the town were to put one out for contracted services. And they also mentioned that they were willing to negotiate or reduce their rates. And so those rates that were proposed to us, and of course this was off the cuff they were able to read our questionnaire, so they came into it understanding what we were going to ask, but this is what they came up with, and we understood $18 to $23 per household is what they could provide estimated. And that's without seeing all the numbers that would go into an RFP. RFPs are extremely detailed documents, as you all know, that really can allow a contractor to put a good price on it, or an accurate price. So again, the options that we evaluated is for the contracted services is can they pick up all residential waste and dispose of it and transport it? That would be kind of the most comprehensive service that they could provide. Otherwise, can the town just contract the waste transport and disposal? So that could be going to a transfer station, dropping it off at the transfer station. The town relinquishes, or it basically relinquishes its generator status at that point of the waste, and the waste can then be disposed of at the responsibility of that party. Or would they be willing to simply haul the collection center containers? That would be a very small proposal, obviously. So speaking of the contracted collection services considerations. So of course, an RFP would have to be released, or a similar RFQ. However, the town would proceed with that for the initial request for qualifications or proposal. And then of course, pricing can vary depending on various factors. So here are some industry standards that I've listed here, or that we've listed here. Contract term, we often see the initial contract term being 7 years for a contracted service of collection of waste collection. That typically coincides pretty closely with vehicle life. That's why we do it that way, and that's kind of the industry standard. From there, you'll often have 3 one-year optional renewals for a total of 10 years for the whole contract. Billing and customer service, depending on the town's current setup, and of course, Pinetop-Lakeside does not have a utility right now, so billing and customer service would have to be entertained. Would that come in-house, or would that be the responsibility of the contractor? Same with cart purchase, maintenance, and storage. I won't get into details. That is a big line item and a big topic of conversation, because that is an asset to a town. It is also, you could see markup if it goes contracted. As far as cost adjustments, under a typical contract, we will see that our annual adjustments, and this feeds into rate stability, which we'll talk to later. Our typical contract will have annual adjustments based on multiple inflation metrics, such as CPI-U, which is essentially the comprehensive one, the CPI garbage and trash, which is often what you'll see in them, and we'll show later on how that correlates, those two correlate, or on EAI, which is the diesel fuel price indices. And then lastly, for disposal, can it be included in the collection fees for the town to procure the separate contractor for disposal only, as we mentioned the last time for the options. So let's talk about town-provided collection services now and how we dissected this system. So here's some assumptions that we wanted to lay out first and what went into our study. So we assumed that if the town were to engage in town-provided collection services, that they would have to acquire all resources needed for this system, which would include equipment and labor, software, you name it, needed to provide these, including the ASLs that we talked about, which we'll get into line item costs soon here on those. You also need space. There's a lot of space to store carts, to maintain the carts. You'll have staging areas before cart deployment. Whenever you have an open system convert over to an organized system, you have to essentially scrape or take all the carts or remove all the carts from the current system, and then stage your new carts and deploy them. You'll also have to stage vehicles such as backup vehicles, which we'll get into soon, and other equipment. Now, as we know, this assumption doesn't matter across any of the scenarios, but the town occupancy rates, of course, are seasonal here, and we'll get into occupancy rates next. Routing analysis and cost of service are specific to the town's current and projected conditions. So as I spoke to earlier, the routing analysis model and the cost of service model that we prepared are very, very specific to the town. And that was, of course, of tremendous help from the Public Works Department to obtain that information. Now we have the town will need to modify any existing permits and complete capital improvements for consolidating collected waste at the collection center. And so we'll get into this later, but essentially we found that the most feasible option is that the town would, if the town were to proceed with this, they would collect tip, which means tip waste, which means consolidate, back the ASL up to a container or some sort, drop the waste into that, and that 20 to 40 yard cubic yard dumpster would then be hauled. And that's what we call long haul. It's the most economical way instead of having these ASLs drive all the way to St. John's. So we'll get into that next, but that's the most feasible setup. That's what this line item speaks to here. So the other assumption is the town will do that. The town will collect, tip, or consolidate and haul and dispose at St. John's or at the Blue Hills landfill. And so the service scenarios, which are very critical to this study, we have two scenarios here. One is, what's the feasibility of servicing the current town limits as they stand right now? We'll see a map here shortly of what those look like. And then the next scenario is kind of the extreme to our understanding, which is current town limits plus 3 annexations. And we're going to refer to those as the Lake Woods annexation, the West annexation, and the East annexation, which is the White Mountain Country Club, Pinetop Country Club, and the Pinetop Lakes Country Club, and the Lake Woods community, which we'll show on a map here too. Just so please, those are the two scenarios that we're really going to be focusing on. So speaking of occupancy assumptions, so we crunching the data, we'll see this on the next slide, it very much correlates with temperature, as we know. You may have a spike in the winter activities, which skiing, hunting, stuff like that may produce an increase in sales tax revenue, which is on this slide right here. So the town was generous to provide this data. And so Philip did an excellent job of crunching the data and charting it right here. So you can see that our assumptions here, and of course this is tax data from 2020, summer of 2020 to fall of 2024, so a couple months ago. And as you'll see here, it is expressed as a percentage of the maximum revenue of July. So July is when you have your peak season here. And every other month is expressed as a proportion of that, just so you can wrap your heads around that. And then, of course, those lines that go across there, across the different bars, those are the averages for the peak season and the off season. So the off season does span to either side, but it's a single line at 70% there. And so you can see May through September is where we determined to be the peak season. And you'll also see, I'm sorry if it's, oh, you can see it on this screen better, but 90% is the average for the peak season, 90% occupancy is how we're going to look at it, and then 70% for the off season. And just for some context here, when we're looking at solid waste collection, regardless of every house is filled during that peak season, we see it as every house is going to be paying that service. They're going to be required to pay the service. So we see it as a residence that needs to be serviced. And we'll talk later about which kind of servicing options they can have, but that's how we see that. And so that's how this is essentially displayed, is that 100% does correlate with 100% servicing. So here's the maps that I was talking to earlier. So we have scenario 1 on the left there, current town limits. And then you can see on the right, scenario 2, which is the current town limits, and also the annexation areas, the 3 annexation areas that were provided to us by town staff. So you have the Lake Woods Annex, the West Annex, and the East Annex. And again, the West Annex, as you all might be familiar with, is the White Mountain Country Club, and then the East Annex is a combination of Pinetop Country Club and Pinetop Lakes Country Club. So our occupancy assumptions for each one of those areas. So you can see here, town limits, and just a caveat, this came from Navajo County parcel data. They did a great job of essentially displaying each parcel. We use GIS to do this, and it said whether there was an or a developed residential structure on there. So you can see the town limits, they had estimated, we were going to round up and say 3,800, and we gave it an occupancy, a partial occupancy rate, so off season, of 70%. And that's based on the sales tax revenue chart that we saw a couple slides ago. The Lake Woods Annex is going to have 3,600 roughly households that will need to be serviced there. We did lower the partial occupancy rate slightly there to 65% because as we all know, this is a summer home community, and some of those country clubs may also have a lesser occupancy rate, which we'll see a little further down. West Annex, same thing, lesser homes. And then East Annex, we saw approximately, let's call it 31 to 3,200 homes, and we gave it a 30% occupancy rate. So just to go back, that is the East Annex down there, the Pinetop Country Club and Pinetop Lakes Country Club. We gave that a 30% occupancy rate. We also used vacation rental statistics. So there's AirDNA, it's a website, we used that among others, and essentially it'll analyze the vacancy rates of of Airbnbs and VRBOs and all those different vacation rentals in a town or in an area. And of course, the vacation rental data, please keep in mind, this was all derived from Sholo. That's where that information came from, just because they had more data, or I'm sorry, they had more data than Pinetop-Lakeside, to our understanding. Okay, so the assumptions on the logistics now. So you can see, again, just to keep it simple here, that the dark blue box on the left, and this is under town-provided services, they would collect the waste from all the residences. They would drive to the collection center where it would be consolidated into roll-off containers. Those roll-off containers would then be hauled to the landfill, tipped, and then the driver would return. And you would have a disposal fee at the working phase of the landfill, or at the toll booth, essentially, at the landfill, and then the driver would return. So we did receive pricing information from Blue Hills, as well as from transfer stations up north of here. And we did incorporate that into our feasibility analysis of if the town were to drive all their ASLs to the transfer station, relinquish the waste there, and then the transfer station were to take it out, consolidate and take it out to the landfill, what would that look like as far as pricing and logistics and operation and time on route? That's a big thing we'll get into here in a second. And so we did, of course, dive into that. And this is ultimately the scenario that we felt was the most feasible, economically and operationally. Also, Blue Hills does have its limitations. It is, as we'll see on a later slide, it is about over an hour away, and there are long wait times at Blue Hills, but they can be longer at some of these transfer stations just because of the convenience and proximity to some of the major, let's call them communities or metropolitans in the area. Now, and like I mentioned, by allowing the consolidation, you get maximization on collection route. So here's the map of what it takes to get from the collection center of the town out to Blue Hills. You can see there's about 3 prominent routes that Google Maps called out, and ranging anywhere from about an hour and 7 minutes to an hour and a half. And it can take anywhere from, then you put 115 to 160 miles on all these ASLs or long hauls by going that distance. All right, so operational considerations. So when we're looking at how to evaluate a system, we look at it from a time perspective. So time on route, time collecting, how many times a day the routes are being run. So we're just going to go down the list here, but please keep in mind that it's very time specific here. So the daily number of routes we assumed, hours spent, we assumed that there's going to be 8 hours a day per driver. We also assume that they're going to be doing it 5 days a week, and that the number of collection routes will, of course, will vary. And we did have 5% of residences are expected to require additional carts. That's because of the dumpsters that we saw around town as well. This is a very common metric for most communities. Some residents will just need 2 for whatever purpose, large family, commercial, whatever it is. This is important because that adds seconds to each route for the ASL to pick that up and to collect that. So then we also had the other assumption that I talked to earlier, which is that we have anywhere from 1.9, let's say, to 2.4 residents per household, and that they're generating approximately 4 pounds of waste per day. Each person is. Each ASL, automated side loader, can hold approximately 8 tons of waste before it needs to tip or to empty its cargo. So the time spent, this is more or less a national average. We typically see 24 seconds to collect cart setouts. So that is the ASL pulling up, putting its arm out, grabbing the cart, tipping it, dumping it, putting it back down, and driving off. I've heard 22 seconds is also a national average. We did tailor it to Pinetop-Lakeside based on the density of houses and how far the ASL would have to go between them. We also saw 2 seconds would be a reasonable drive time between or path to go past non-set out. So if somebody didn't set out because they're on vacation or they forgot, it would take approximately 2 seconds to drive past that house or that residence. We also envisioned that off-route time spent would be about an hour and a half a day. This is breaks, inspections, tipping at the collection center. And then, as I mentioned down there at the last item there, time spent driving to and tipping at the collection center and then returning to route is about 30 minutes. So 10, 10, 10 is what we see. 10 minutes to get off route, 10 minutes to tip, 10 minutes to get back on route. All right, so what does it look like for the town to service scenario 1, which is the current town limits? So Philip did a great job of crunching the numbers here and determining what the requirements were. So we calculated that one ASL route would be needed. So you basically have one driver running around 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That would collect the current town limits trash adequately. With that, you would have to have a few equipment items here. You'd have to have the frontlined ASL. You'd also have a backup in case that one goes down. I know you all have some inclement weather up here occasionally, especially on the cold side. That backup would absolutely come into play. And you need that, otherwise service doesn't get done that day. You also have a frontline roll-off, now a roll-off truck. Now, to understand, the town does also have the ability to lease roll-offs, so we did not put it was a requirement to have a backup. They've done that before, where they can go out and lease roll-off trucks, so they can do that on a convenient notice, because this is not an everyday task. Also, for personnel, you'll need one solid waste manager, an ASL driver, a roll-off driver, a backup CDL driver, sometimes they call in sick, take PTO, and then also an administrative assistant. Now let's look at that same setup for the current limits plus all annexation areas. So you can see it does ramp up. We saw that, and just to back up, the current town limits, I believe, are, like I said, around 3,800 households. If you do scenario 2, it's closing in on 11,000 households, which is 200% growth roughly, about 3x. And so you can see here, we see that in the full occupancy, you go up to 3 ASL routes, and then during partial occupancy, you actually go down to 2 ASL routes. Now this does cause a dynamic that needs to be considered if the town were to look to town provided services. Because then you look at the next row for equipment, and we have 3 ASLs, of course, that will be servicing, one backup would be sufficient on that ratio. 20% minimum reserves is usually what we like to see. One frontline roll-off truck and one backup. Now you go to partial, this is where it does get tricky. For conservation of resources, what we did was we took one of the 3 frontline ASLs from the full occupancy, and we moved that to a backup ASL. That's because it's an interesting setup here. You don't have large towns nearby that would be able to borrow that ASL while it's sitting idle for you all. So it makes it challenging in that aspect that you could have an idle vehicle. You would have to rotate them all. That's how these machines are built. So these backups would have to get into service throughout the partial occupancy. As far as the frontline roll-offs, they maintain the same. As far as staff goes down below, so you can see the mix, very, very similar to the scenario 1. However, you will have more drivers, of course. Again, conservation of resources. We're looking at it as that one frontline would shift to a backup. And that would just help that you would not have to hire and fire every season. Other operational considerations that we looked into for this evaluation of town provided services is that the collection center supervisor would shift to a solid waste manager position. The town would maintain a minimum of 20% reserve. So like we talked about, so in the case of the scenario 1 where you have 1 ASL route, of course a reserve of 1 ASL is 100%, it's a backup ASL. But ultimately, if you can get to that scale or those economies of scale, 20% minimum is the target for both collection equipment and personnel. Of course, like I mentioned, you're all snowplow routes. The Public Works Department is very pleased with them. We've looked at them, but we did not look at the GIS side of them. But they did inform us that the GIS is very sufficient and it can take on the collection routing as well. So that was a great thing to hear. The town should consider a license for billing and customer service software if they were to enter the collection services. And then they should also look to develop solid waste ordinances, such as that if you live in an area, let's call it scenario 1 town limits, that a resident is required to have service from the town. Those could be such ordinances. And then also you can have enforcement ordinances and so on and so forth. Okay, so now let's look at the numbers, the financial numbers behind town-provided collection. So when we developed this financial model, we looked at it as we obtained the data, we kicked it off, we had to kick off with the staff, continued to talk to staff, then we developed a test year revenue requirement. And so we got the 2024 budget and we made adjustments to that to basically what it looks like if you were to go into a town-provided collection system. So that is adding staff, adding vehicles, and deducting or reducing any one-time fees such as a CapEx expense or a capital expense that would not otherwise have gone to the next year. So then we allocated those costs to cost centers, which we'll see on the next slide, identified the cost of service, so what does it cost to break even, essentially, on various operations. And then also, we developed the rate recommendations to support the financial integrity of the fund. And what that means is we analyze this so that this system or this operation can stand alone and would not be dependent on other funds such as the enterprise fund. It can fund itself. So that's what that last item says there. So again, kind of to break down how the financials went here. We had the 2024 budget. We then had the gross revenue requirements that we made adjustments to. And that gave us our test year, which was a 2024 test year. And then from there, we allocated the cost to the cost centers. And we are looking at everything going forward is now what it would look like for fiscal year 2025 if the town were to provide services. And so you can see the cost services cost centers down there that we've listed. Administration, collection center, container hauling, the sale of recycling commodities, which is actually revenue, it's not a cost, but we did account for that. Trash collection, big line item. Disposal, big line item. Public education and outreach, the cart purchase and repair, and of course, customer service and billing. So here's some numbers to digest. So we looked into ASLs. Essentially, they're running just shy of $500,000 these days, and you're looking at a 7-year useful life. We looked at the payoff of a 5% interest rate over that 7 years for a rough estimate of, let's call it $78,000 per year. Same with the transfers trailer. You can see $300,000 and paid off over 10 years at that same interest rate. We calculated ASL maintenance at $35,000 per year. Transfer station trailer maintenance at $15,000 per year. Equipment fuel, the ASL is looking at $10,000 per year. Transfer trailer assumed at $20,000 per year. Equipment insurance at $10,000 per vehicle per year. The salary and benefits. So these were hourly rates provided by the town for fiscal year 2025. You can see the hourly rates there. And they do include the benefits as well. So that is something that the town did talk to us about on collection center revenues and balancing that budget as well as the benefits of town personnel. We are looking at the cart purchase and repair. As we see, $60 total per cart on a 10-year to even 15-year useful life. We did do 10-year as a conservative value for this study. That does require it to be paid off quicker, which does elevate the cost. But some of these cart manufacturers these days are putting out guarantees or warranties for 15 years. So we are seeing a lot of useful life out of them. We assumed $2.04 for maintenance per cost per cart per year. That's replacing lids, wheels, stuff like that. Not actually replacing the entire cart, which would be a full new cart. Public outreach and education, we assumed $3 per household per year. That's mailing, any other type of outreach initiative. Customer service and billing software, $3 per household per year. Landfill disposal, so $35 per ton is what Blue Hills did quote us. And that is assuming that they get 5,000 tons or more per year. So that's essentially the lowest rate that could be negotiated, to our understanding. Utility billing, we looked at $0.67 per year per household per month. All right, so budget forecasting. So how we essentially looked at FY 2025. So we did take conservative numbers here for the annual inflation that we applied to each one of these topics or these categories. So let's focus on the chart that we can see there, and Mayor and Council member, I know you can't see this, but I'll try to describe it the best I can. The cumulative CPI has since 2012 has tracked lower than CPI index for garbage and trash. And so you can see there's several bars at the bottom of this graph, and essentially the garbage and trash has always outperformed the cumulative CPI, except for recently when we did see some elevated inflations. So this is a conservative value that we use, this CPI adjustment based on the garbage and trash index. So what is the revenue requirement for fiscal year 2025 by scenario? So you can see here that multiple line items are broken up by cost center, and it essentially says what is it going to cost for that exact cost center for each scenario, for assuming that you started next year. So administration, we have $158,000 or $159,000, let's call it. That stays the same across both scenarios. Same with the collection center, which to run that collection center, we're looking at $116,000 roughly across both scenarios. Container hauling, it does slightly increase. So that is essentially hauling the containers from the collection center as it stands right now, as well as hauling the long haul containers or the consolidated containers from the collection center to the landfill. And of course that ramps as as servicing households ramps. We do have the sale of recycling commodities staying the same at $220,000 per year of revenues. Trash collection, we calculated at $371,830 for the first year. I'm sorry, for the first scenario, and then it essentially doubled for the second scenario, obvious reasons. However, if I back up, we did say that you're looking at 200% growth between scenario 1 and scenario 2. And this kind of feeds throughout all these numbers here. We're seeing, you might see 2x in cost, but we're seeing 3x in services. So economies of scales is really starting to kick in for scenario 2. For disposal, another large line item, this would stay proportional, of course, to tonnages or collected households. For public education and outreach, we have this going up again on an economy of scale. We're looking at roughly $29,000 for the first scenario, and then we're looking at roughly $52,000 for scenario 2. Cart purchase and repair, we're looking at $48,500 for the first scenario, and that does ramp up as a proportion to the number of households. That does not have an economy of scale there. And then lastly, customer service and billing, we do see a ramp, but we also see economies there at $88,388, moving to $143,051. And you can see the total revenue requirements are more or less $1.2 million for scenario 1 to service the town, town-provided services, and then $2.152 million to service under scenario 2. So as we can see there, it isn't the 200% growth that we would, or I'm sorry, the 200% increase that we would see in growth. All right, so here's where it really all boiled down to is what is it going to cost each household per month for the town to provide services under each scenario. So to break this down, you'll see the collection center fee on the left. So this collection center is basically what is it going to cost per household per month to break even for the collection center, to balance it out. So we're looking at 88 cents for scenario 1. We're looking at 37 cents for scenario 2. Now, this is a constant whether the customer is on active residential collection, as in they're putting their can out every day and they have not gone to what we call a vacation hold. So you can see that, say there is a resident that is needing service. Under scenario 1, we calculated that under town provided services, the resident would be paying $27 $2,278 plus the 88 cents for the collection center. Now, if that resident were to go on vacation, they were to leave, they were to not need service, whatever it was, sometimes we'll see folks that just reduce their waste generation for those months because maybe family's not in town, maybe they're permanent residents, they don't have family staying with them during the summer. They can reduce. You can also not set out. They can go to the collection center and you can go on what they call a vacation hold. So there is a vacation hold for scenario 1 of $12.13 plus the 88 cents. And that would be no service to the house, but they would still have to pay that because ultimately the ASL that would normally pick up their trash is still running routes. There's just a lot of costs that are still being incurred whether they're setting out or not. Now, as we can see, we go to scenario 2. This is where economy scales really come into play. We're now looking at $18.07 for an active resident plus the 37 cents for the collection, or $7.67 plus the 37 cents for collection. Put the vacation hold in perspective. We are going through this process, of course, with other towns and cities in Arizona as well. And we talked to the private haulers out there, and the vacation hold, this is actually a very good vacation hold. We are seeing other ones where they might give 3 months of free vacation, but then there's a reinstatement fee, and then they'll start billing regardless of whether the residents are back after a certain time frame too. So this is looking like a very attractive number. Okay, so with all that digested, now we're going to go into which criteria we evaluated to be important to this system and then most important to the town. So you can see there, we highlighted 4 of the most important evaluation criteria to operating a collection system here in the town through any one of those 3 options, whether it's status quo, contracted, or town provided. So the evaluation criteria, and I'll state the 4 most important first: cost per household per month, which we saw on that last slide, rate stability, customer satisfaction, and collection efficiencies. And 3 more considerations were administrative burden to town, the projected material diversion, and the flexibility to address town growth. So we're going to go into each one of these and see how they score as we scored them for the town's for the 2 scenarios. So just a reminder, we talked about the 3 methods of collection: status quo, by contractor, by town. Now for scoring, what you'll see on these next slides, if you see a number 3, that's the most recommended method for that criteria. So for example, if you see a 3 next to cost per household per month, 3 means it's the most recommended, as in that case, it's the lowest. 2 is sufficient, and 1 is the least recommended. We see the most weaknesses or the least amount of benefits with that one. Now we'll also have a brief description of each criteria and how it kind of plays into that evaluation criteria. The more points, the higher the recommendation. And then of course at the end, we'll tally them all up in a matrix. So let's focus on cost per household per month, one of the most important metrics that we see in all communities. So under scenario 1, this feeds into a couple of the slides, kind of a blend of slides here. The status quo, we're looking at $20 to $27, which we know that 20 is liable to ramp up to 23 in short time. Now under contracted services, they did tell us $18 to $23 is what would be proposed on the RFPs. And then of course town provided under scenario 1, like we saw in the cost of service graphs, above $28. And that includes, of course, let's call it the most expensive option, which is active plus collection center. Now for scenario 2, we do see a significant shift. So we see that status quo, well, of course, we're assuming it'll stay the same for purposes of this study. And as we know, you grow in population, you could have more competition come to town because there's more houses to feed, and so, or to service, more mouths to feed in the waste world. And so that could fluctuate based on competition. We looked at contracted services. Again, we looked at that as in contracts. That'll typically state the growth that we're looking at. So that rate we're saying will stay the same. And of course, that is given a a contract term, which is an important consideration we'll talk about later, about what happens when that contract expires and what can happen to rates then. And then, of course, town-provided services under scenario 2, we see less than $19, which is less than the other scenarios. Of course, contracted services, $18 is higher, and of course you could have one that matches 19, but there are many benefits of economies of scale. So as far as rate stability goes, we did not see differentiation between the two scenarios. Status quo, of course, dependent on competition. Contracted services, this is of course going to be negotiated through the contract, and then it's going to have very clear outlined adjustments going forward for annual increases and so on and so forth. And then of course town provided, what we can see and what happens in some towns, in fact one we're doing right now is they say we want to make sure we can have a stable rate for the entire contract, or in this case it's an entire contract. What does that look like? And so we can come up with a cost of service number that is the service plus the administration fee, basically your overhead of what that costs to run, and you're building up a bit of a reserve, and then it tapers off to break even at the end of the term, so your residents will have that straight rate the whole time, and that is often a preferred method by communities. Not to that extent of the full contract, but at least to get maybe a couple or a few years to be covered. So customer satisfaction, we did not see differentiation across the three scenarios. We did see that various levels of customer service could stem from status quo. Therefore, we recommended that the least. Contracted services, we put them as number 2 because again, town involvement would theoretically ramp that up and would cause a good customer satisfaction environment. And then of course, we put the town as the most recommended in this case because you all know your residents and you would address them accordingly, and it's the most beneficial to you. Now, collection efficiencies, we broke these up into 2. So for scenario 1, so under status quo, you have multiple vehicles on the road, and you'll have possibly disorganized collection schedules and potential changes of service. So if, say, you're contracting with one contractor, you're unhappy with their services, and you go to another, you can have now that truck may not have a route on your street yet. You are now having that truck come all the way out of its way to service your cart. And that's just an extreme example, but that's kind of what we see on the status quo setup. That's why it's least recommended here. Contracted services, we have that as the most recommended for collection efficiencies. And that's really coming from, these are experienced, and of course the RFP will have guidelines and criteria that will establish this, but you're looking for an experienced service provider. So you're looking at it being them having great routing software, customer service, collection vehicles on hand, knowledge of the industry, and so on and so forth. The town, we did put them in the middle there at 2, and so they would oversee all the aspects. Initiation of the system could have some inefficiencies. It is a whole new system, so of course, learning how to run the routes, how to field calls, and how to efficiently transfer waste, that all can come with have inefficiencies built into them. So how do those differ from scenario 2? We see that the status quo, we saw that as the same issues, essentially, or the same description. For contracted services, we actually put that as sufficient, as a middle recommended. And that's because you're going to have more complex routing. Now, yes, these firms do have the software and what have you to be able to route them. At least a lot of them do. The national ones, some of the smaller ones may not. But it does come with more complex routing. Now, the town, we put them as most recommended for this because it would go concurrent with the snowplow routing, which y'all are very good at this point from our understanding. And it'll give the flexibility for access to difficult areas. So one thing we saw when we were driving around your town is the things that a lot of solid waste drivers don't like to see, which is dead ends, what we call hammerheads, which is essentially another setup of dead ends where you have to back in, back out, dangerous, safety alerts, just things like that. You all know your town very well, and those difficult areas you would navigate accordingly, and you also have the ability to improve them, whereas the contractor would have to work through to get them improved. So put a dead end into a cul-de-sac, have a less narrow road and expand it so that the ASL doesn't have to back all the way up, or if they do, it's not as confined, things like that. Administrative burden, pretty self-explanatory. Status quo, town not directly involved. We put that as the most recommended for as far as the lowest burden to the town. Of course, contracted services, town would have oversight, and then town provided services, that's the least recommended because we would have the highest overhead of administrative burden. Projected material diversion, we grouped these, we did not differentiate between scenarios. For status quo, we did have the decentralization of services mainly to reduce diversion and public education. And what that is you might have all these haulers out there all telling the residents different messages, and they may or may not inform of the collection center that you all have available and what the benefits are of using it. And so we put that as the least recommended. Now, contracted services, we put that as number 2, which is sufficient. And of course, the contract, you can build that in. You can have them, you can require them to use that. You can require them to include that in their public outreach and so on and so forth to where it could promote material diversion. And of course, we put the town as number 3 because they would, or we assumed that you would all promote that the most. And the last criteria, flexibility to address town growth. So again, did not differentiate between scenarios here. We put the status quo as least recommended, and this is because a big one here is when you're looking at status quo, you have independent haulers that may or may not be listening to town council meetings to understand annexations. They may not be staying up to date. They may not be ready for a new annex. They may not have enough lead time. They're at the mercy of resources, such as ASLs and carts. So say you have, I'm trying to remember the big one. I think it was the East Annex, the Pinetop Country Club and Pinetop Lakes Country Club. Say that one came online all of a sudden, and these haulers have to scramble to service that. If you have an inflow of orders for carts, these haulers may not be able to address that, and they may not have had the lead time. So we rated that at the least recommended option. Contracted services, of course, they'll be working closely with the town. However, sometimes contract terms can limit how much growth can come in. So say you went for an additional annex or something unforeseen in the contract happened, servicing might be difficult and might have to go into some sort of negotiations to service that. And of course, town provided, y'all would know what's going to happen. You would anticipate growth, and you'd be able to stay ahead of it, including with cart orders and equipment orders, personnel hiring, etc. So let's look at the scoring matrix for all those numbers that you saw all put into one place. So this is where the rubber meets the road for this study. So we're looking at the summary matrix for scenario 1 on how we recommend the different collections based on these criteria. So just to jump down to the bottom, for status quo, the total, not looking at town weighted or town selected criteria, we're looking at status quo received 10 points, which is the least recommended and the lowest amount of points. Contracted services, we see had 16 points, which is tied with town provided services at 16 points. Now, if you go into the weighting or the selected criteria, which is again, cost per household per month, rate stability, customer satisfaction, and collection efficiencies, we see that status quo is still the least recommended at 5 points. Contracted services is now the most recommended at 10 points, and town provided services is sufficient at 9 points. So the tiebreaker between total went based on the selected, and so therefore, for the scenario 1, we recommend contracted collection services. And of course, we did see that the town was competitive in a lot of the town provided services would be competitive there. So it would really come down to, and I'll back up a slide, come down to if the town decided that one criteria had more weight than another one. For example, if cost per household per month was the most important metric, then we could revisit that slide and you could make a decision off of that. And so that is for the town's consideration. So let's look at the scenario 1 recommendation of contracted collection services. So we just have a quick overview of what that is. So they came in at the most cost effective for scenario 1 with contracted rates at approximately $18 to $23 per month. and it can also come into stable and predictive pricing based on contract terms. You could have improved efficiency. We talked about the efficiencies of these haulers. They do it, that is their day job. The enhanced service levels. So they would be tied in with the town very, very closely. So of course the town would have input on some of the most important things to a lot of towns, customer satisfaction, and of course the billing, customer service, you name it. Lower risk, so of course that plays into the efficiencies. We just saw it as there is the potential for for less inefficiencies with contracted services for scenario one, given the 3,800 households or so. So our recommendation is for current town limits, it would provide an economical and efficient solution. So now for scenario two. Now we're getting into economy scales like we were talking about, or economies of scale, and we will jump down to the bottom again. So status quo for the total of all categories not weighted or selected by town, we're looking at 9 points, which was the least recommended. Contracted services now tallies 14 points, which is sufficient, and we see town provided services at 19 points, which is the most recommended for scenario two, which is current town limits plus the annexations. As far as town selected criteria goes, we see the status quo tallied to 4 points, at least recommended. Contracted services, 8 points as sufficient. And town provided services at 12 points as most recommended. So we do recommend for scenario two that the town provide services for economies of scale. And this is for the town's consideration, of course. So opportunities, full control over the operations, and also customer satisfaction. It'll promote your collection center. So you will have full control on being able to do public outreach, promoting recycling through the collection center, looking at how to make your collection center the most efficient. Whereas contracted services, you would have to build that into a contract. Otherwise, the collection center would probably become a thing in the rear view mirror. No pun intended, but that's how they operate a lot. Also, again, it would promote the collection center, and it would balance. You all could use it to balance the budget. That's what we saw with that cost of service, where that collection center line item was to make the collection center whole. Now, some challenges, of course, seasonal variability. We could see that across all those all the methods as well. Now, this is an important one. One challenge we can see is time needed to start service. So because you all don't have this service in-house yet, it could take 1 to 2 years, whereas a contracted service could take slightly less. And I say slightly, some of these, RFP process plus procurement of all the equipment and resources and everything, that does take time. And sometimes we're talking to some of these haulers, some of the bigger haulers, they are getting out ahead of the cart production. They're really getting out ahead of the ASLs, and they're ordering them multiple years in advance because they foresee growth. That's something that could be a consideration. It's just time to ramp up to start of service. So of course our recommendation for scenario two is the town provided services may be viable in the future but are not recommended for current conditions. So of course they may be viable in scenario two but not recommended for scenario one. So the town may consider offering the town services upon town growth or annexation. And last, one of the last slides, so our recommendation for the current system is ultimately it was the least recommended. We have high residential costs. We do have lack of oversight. We do have operational efficiencies. We have, of course, the environmental and safety concerns, especially when you have multiple trucks running the same road every day. Safety is number one in this industry, in the solid waste industry. I know it's number one to y'all too. And so that is definitely a big thing to consider. So our recommendation is that the status quo or current system is not recommended option for the town or its residents for either scenario. And of course, this is our disclaimer that this is all for planning purposes. There were a lot of assumptions that we stated. We have a lot more in our documents that we use to create that have been boiled down to what you saw here. So I'll open the floor up for questions.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Simmons? Anybody here have?
Yes, I do have a question.
Well, yeah. Do you have a question?
You can go.
Go ahead.
So just in your model, you were using a GIS to kind of build routes and times and everything. We do have streets that are not part of that snow plowing. And did you guys, is that one of the assumptions that we're just not seeing too, or?
Yes, and so, yeah, we understood that you have county roads throughout the town, and so the town does not maintain those, but there are service collections on those. And those are the roads you're talking about?
Well, they're kind of not maintained roads that are within the city limits, or easements that are, I mean, that's where the cans would be, that are not plowed roads, though. They're within our, yeah.
Private roads, basically, within the town.
Yeah.
Okay, understandable. No, great question. So that could actually play into solid waste ordinances. So the town could, what we'll see sometimes, especially from the safety aspect, and a lot of haulers will actually will ask this, is that I said hammerhead or T-head, or just depiction. It's a road that goes straight and then it tees and it dead ends at both sides, and it's surrounded by residentials. What haulers will do, and we're actually looking at this in a town south of Tucson currently right now, actually, that exact logistic. And of course, it kind of plays into all these. What you could do is have it in the contract or solid waste ordinance to move those carts out to the outside of that hammerhead for safety reasons. And so that could absolutely be enacted in there. And I'm going to rely on my coworker too, Philip, for all these questions, just to make sure we cover everything. So Philip, can you hear me and hear council member? And can you add anything to that?
Yeah. Well, speaking on the GIS, our routing model is, we did not use GIS to develop the routes. It's an Excel-based model that's based on the time and motion used to collect based on industry standards. So our assumption is that you have a standardized amount of time, and based on communications with town staff, the assumption is that y'all are very efficient with your ability to snow plow. And like Jack was saying, there would have to be the ordinances to address what would you do in the situation that you're not managing certain aspects of the roads. But we don't anticipate any adjustments to the collection efficiency, which would impact the number of trucks, the number of routes that would be required to collect. You would just have to kind of address it from a city policy perspective about how it would be collected.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yep.
Jerry, you had a question?
Well, I had a couple of questions on some of your basic assumptions, and one of them was going back to your slide where you had the households based on tax revenue. I assume. Let's see if that's it. Go back one. It says that you're basing your occupancy for the town based on tax revenue. Is it solely tax revenue? Is it a direct correlation between tax revenue and occupancy?
Yes, good question. So for occupancy, we did also use, as you'll see on this slide, excuse me, the vacation rental statistics as well. So we did compare those. But Philip, do you want to talk to that on our assumptions for occupancy?
Well, yeah. The question was that, correct me if I'm wrong, but Kevin, our tax revenue in the summer changes drastically, not because of the people moving back here, but because of the visitors that are coming here. And so that skews, I would think that would skew your whole assumption about occupancy. But that's just a question I have, and if you want to go back and look at it, then fine. But that would be what I would question. The second one was your scenario 2 included annexation of the country club areas. And we've looked at that to see if we thought we could afford to do that, and it doesn't, every time we've looked at it, we said there's just not enough occupancy in the wintertime, and there's not enough home ownership that actually pays taxes, property taxes here. They don't pay them as their primary residence. So I think that changes. I know you have some estimates in here, but I think that changes drastically too. We may not be able to count on the number of people that you're saying we get in the year-round if we annex the country club areas.
Yeah, great questions. So I'll defer to Philip for occupancy questions that you have there.
Yeah.
So that
just questions I have about your assumptions, and I know that this is a hell of a model. You guys have done. I mean, it's obvious why we can't make this decision by saying, "Oh, yeah, that sounds good."
Yeah, well, I appreciate that,
or it doesn't sound good. I mean, it's a very complicated process, and we appreciate all you're doing.
Yeah, well, you keyed in on probably one of the most complex parts of the whole study. So, great questions. Figuring out occupancy was something we toiled with a lot to make sure that we had a very hardened case for it. So, yeah, Philip, would you like to speak to council members' questions?
Yeah, so you'll see from the partial that we think that the town's baseline is around that 70% occupancy. We do agree with you that 20% swing is partially from people coming to their second home, but also we think that those are rental units, and that's exhibited by the number of households throughout the town that have those dumpsters, multiple containers. We think that those households will still be captured by the collection system, even if they are, being visited by temporary residents, and it would be the responsibility of the property owner to engage with the town or the collection provider through the contract to acquire solid waste services still, and so that's why we consider that in the model. And speaking just, we don't consider it the direct correlation to sales tax. So we know that, your sales tax going up from June to July doesn't necessarily mean that the population has spiked, the exact amount. It's meant to communicate just in general, there are more people present in the town at that time, so more money is being spent, which is why we use those monthly averages to kind of just hide some of that variance in those numbers. And then remind me again, the second part of the question was about. The second question was.
Second wasn't if you annex the country clubs. We have found that annexation of the country clubs loses money for the town because we're paying more for roads and police than we're getting in revenue from the time they're here.
Yeah, and so we completely understand that, and so that's why we did show the two extremes of the scenarios, so the baseline and also all of the annexes. And if the long-term vision is that these annexes are not going to be added because of those additional financial concerns that you've expressed, then I think we've shown in scenario one that you'll have greater efficiencies by going through the contracted process. This is just to show you that, the two edges of the extreme. So it comes down to that policy decision of where are the balances, and really you need to consider how that would affect your police department, the development of streets, all of those resources kind of piggyback off of the solid waste collection. You need to weigh it all.
And that's things that we have to look at. Yeah, exactly right. Okay. And I know it really skewed the scenario two, really skewed the numbers though a lot with that assumption of all of those people being customers. So that's all I'm saying.
Okay, Councilman Turner has a question.
The takeaway for me was it's obvious from this data that there doing something besides the status quo is preferable for our citizens. And so my mind jumps to, how do we do that? How do we implement something different? And I don't know if we can answer that tonight, but that's what's rolling through my head is there's got to be some initial cost the first couple of years, maybe the first 18 months, that, and then this equipment over 7 to 10 years will get amortized or whatever the right terminology is to spread out over the life of the contract. So what I'm thinking is probably something that needs to be hammered out with whichever contracted service company works with the town. But there's a lot of advantages to doing something different. 2025 might be aggressive, but it depends on, well, that's next month. I guess as we go through the approval process here, I'll just probably bring this up again, but it probably won't get an answer if we decide to do something different until we can talk to contractors.
Yeah, and great points. I mean, that is the next steps. You know, those are the big ones. And to keep it high level, so the contracted services, and there's a slide for that. That roughly what would be next would be an RFP would have to be developed, and that RFP again would have to go through the town to make sure that it had all of the terms and conditions, because we do put a templated contract in there, basically an ideal contract in there that the haulers can take exceptions to or not, and that's actually critical in our evaluation criteria. But you would develop that and release it to the street, and once it's on the street, you can inform haulers however the methodology would go, and they would bid, and you go through the whole evaluation process, and then have a start of service date stated in that RFP. It's all very well laid out. I mean, the plan is very transparent for all parties. Town provided, of course, we would forego the RFP process, go straight into resource acquirement and CapEx. So keep it high level. I totally agree with you. Those are definitely discussions that the town needs to have on, what would be the next step for either, and what would be make the most sense.
A lot of great information. I'm glad I had a cup of coffee here to keep me sharp.
Thank you. Yes.
You guys did great work here.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And we'll have many more discussions about this. I have a few questions for you, but before that, let me go to Mayor or Councilmember Heisler. Any questions?
They're call dropped. They're not.
Okay. All right. Okay.
So I have a question. Scenario one is the 1.2 million revenue requirement. That would be if it's 100% city initiated doing the service, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the other one, the contract one, would just be out, and the contractor is going to provide the funding in exchange for the revenue.
Yes, there's multiple ways to work that, but yes, typically what you'll see is the service fee. So you'll see, let's call it $18. And that'll be what the contractor is going, assuming they do, let's assume they do billing. They will bill the resident $18 a month, plus the town's going to have admin on top. So you'll have an inspector on there to make sure that they're running around doing the right thing. You'll have code enforcement making sure the contractor is doing what, or the residents are doing what they need to do. You'll have someone that oversees the whole process too, the liaison for the town. So you'll have your overhead. So now you'll have 18 plus, let's call it $2.
So that overhead is what the town would have to add that onto that $18 per household to, otherwise would be in the negative.
Correct. Yeah, and so that's a great point. So when you look at the cost of service per household, I don't want to, give everyone, make everyone go crazy by flipping all these slides. But when you see all the household or the cost per household per month numbers on there, you're correct that the contracted service values that are stated there do not include the town administration fee, which will always, to my understanding, will always come into play. And that would be most advantageous for the town. Otherwise, you have a contractor doing their own thing on their own dime with full reign over your residents. And I don't know that any town would, accept that.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. I've got a few questions for you. Just in general, vacation hold. I mean, I've lived in a lot of communities around the country. Do communities typically have a vacation hold where they lower the rate if you don't for a while?
Great question. So, talking with a lot of haulers these days, they're actually trying to get away from it as much as possible. It creates a lot of disruptions in their systems. It would absolutely be a consideration for the town if it was town provided, because what happens is someone calls up, says, I would like a vacation hold. They put it on hold. Well, the resident decides off this, off their cuff to come up that next weekend. And you're not looking to service their cart, but the cart's on the road. And so ASL services it for customer satisfaction, and because it's a cart there, and you did it for free. And so they are really looking to whittle that back. But we did include it here because of your heavy presence of second homes.
Okay.
And so it is a consideration, and it's a lot of times, like I said, you'll have no fee recovery if they call and they do it for free. So in this case, you would at least have fee recovery for if the cart was put out. There would be something there, but it would not be accounted for in this rate.
Okay. Another question is, did you determine how many truckloads the ASL would make per day, just picking up and taking to the transfer station?
Yeah, excellent question. So I'll let Philip pull that up. He's got the routing analysis model on his screen, I think. Philip, can you speak to that? Of the bike scenario?
Give me 1 second. So for the current town boundaries, I'll share that number. That would be around 3 to 4 trips for disposal per day by the ASL trucks, and that's based on where Jack was saying we've taken the census data on assumed persons per household, and then just EPA data on the amount of waste that an individual would take per day, and then looking at that 8 tons of trash that the ASL body can hold at a time. That allowed us to then estimate how much trash would be generated on a daily basis, and by then taking the maximum capacity of the trash, which is 8 tons per load, we get around 3 disposal trips per day when you guys are at full occupancy. When it's at partial occupancy, that number drops down to about 2 trips per day.
Okay, all right. Thank you. And then, and I know you mentioned something in the beginning that you weren't going to really talk about today. I guess my biggest question is, was there any consideration of what I would call a hybrid operation? Where, for example, the town purchases the carts and possibly the town transports, since we have the equipment to do so, to the final destination, but we hire a contractor to do all the pickups and drop off. I mean, did you look at that at all?
Yes, great question. And yes, that is very common. There's a lot of scenarios there, and it's ultimately you're going to see a very similar rate to contracted services. So it's just a matter of responsibility delegation and who's getting the more of the cost. So for example, one scenario is the contractor does all the collection and the town does the billing and customer service, but the contractor purchased the carts. And so you'll have a higher administrative burden for that billing and customer service that the town is doing. That could be one synchronous agreement there. You could also see where the town purchases the carts, does the customer billing, does the public outreach, does other ones of those line items. And we can go back to those cost centers, but they can be divvied up across the board. And in fact, you could even go the other way where town provides collection and a third party or a contractor does billing and customer service, you bring everything to that transfer station, they do the disposal. So there's a lot of combinations there. But yes, we considered a lot. Go ahead, Philip.
And the way that we can write RFPs, or the way that we'll write RFPs with our clients, is we'll make essentially every service optional, so that the town or the city can then decide what aspects they want to take on themselves. So it's another matter of how do you write up the procurement document so that you can then decide at a later date what is most advantageous to your community. Yeah,
and we did that for the town south of Tucson. It's there were core services to be bid on, which was collection of trash and collection of recycling. Every other service was optional, and that was bulk pickup, as in you can put bulk out on the street, you know, mattresses and what have you. The customer service and billing, the purchase of the carts, the cart repair and maintenance, cart staging. So, you know, that's a big thing too, is y'all have land up off of Porter Mountain Road that could be utilized for that if you were to go that route. But otherwise, you might have to lease it or something to the contractor to use. Would you perform the cart maintenance? So every time a resident called up and said, my lid fell off, would you have to bring it into your fleet maintenance crew or a separate? So all those kind of a suite of options that you can decide which to do. And a lot of times it's cost.
Okay. All right. You have another question?
Yeah, I got one more. I just happened to think of it when you were talking about that. Do you, in your assumptions, did you assume that every household in the town would be mandated to use the service?
Correct.
Oh.
Yes, and that is...
That's a tough one.
That is...
because some people might like to go to the collection center and take their own trash.
We understand, and every community faces that, is that somebody doesn't generate that much trash, and so they do not feel like they should be part of the program. There are ways to address that in solid waste ordinances. But Philip, that was our assumption.
Well, you have to assume something, yeah, but that's a really, really tough one for the lower income people. Okay.
And one thing to do that we are actually talking about with another town is applied subsidies. So you could look at it exactly this. It is a mandatory service across the entire area, let's call it, whichever scenario you're in or in the interim. But you could have it on there that if you meet certain criteria, maybe it's a household income or what have you, that you can apply for a subsidy and the town could potentially find funds to subsidize the services for that. It is an option that towns explore. And it's to specifically address your concern of maybe a lower income or a less waste generating household.
Are you aware if there's grants out there for that, for subsidies?
Philip, did you hear council member's question there?
Yes, I did. I'm not aware of grant opportunities at the moment that provide support for that, but it's definitely something that could be looked into.
Okay. Another question?
Yeah, could there be an opt-out option for folks that don't want to have a can?
You could certainly do it. I mean, it's up to your all's discretion, but that is typically not preferred. It does reduce economies of scale at that point, because if you have one resident, I'll do it in extreme, one resident on a long street at the very end and they ask for it and everyone else opts out, that ASL has to make that run, and so cost of service will go up because your number of households go down. Is that correct, Philip?
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's another policy decision of if the town would want to allow for the opportunity to opt out, but it's exactly like Jack was saying. By requiring it of everyone, you can plan for a steadier stream of revenue, which just from the financial planning perspective does create benefits to the town.
Just food for thought, Vice Mayor. Gated communities, would they be status quo or would they possibly get included?
No, they would be, if they're in the town, they would be included.
Okay.
Is under this.
Yeah, the solid waste ordinances would come into play. In fact, right now we're working with the town that they passed a resolution that essentially said there's a lot of HOAs that all have negotiated rates that have expiration dates, and they're within town limits. And so the resolution that the town passed essentially says, by this date, you need to comply with, by the expiration of your contract, it cannot be renewed and you have to go to the required town service. It's kind of a phased approach, because now you're going to have these pockets. It is going to boost, cost of service in the meantime, because these households won't be serviced. But you're going to have these pockets that'll slowly come online as contracts expire. But yes, gated communities, private communities, such like that, passcodes would be given to the haulers. They could get in, and it would all be based on town ordinances.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
One more quick question. Do you know if any of the other towns that you guys have helped develop, so right now we have the collection center, and everyone who goes to the collection center has to pay a fee for whatever they're dropping. Do typically in the other towns that you've helped develop contracts for, do they make if you're part of the town and you're already mandated to pay whatever the $20 a month for your pickup or whatever it is, can you now use that collection area for free to drop off? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, great
You're
question.
still going to have to pay an additional fee if you use the collection center.
Great question. I'll defer to Philip. So Philip, does that 88 cents and that 37 cents, does that account for that so that now it's a free service to residents?
So that still considers the amount of revenue that would be, that was the sale of recycling commodities line items you saw on that test year revenue requirement slide. That assumes that the rates would still be charged. And the reason for that is because we know that there are individuals coming from all over, from the annexed areas. But in other communities, I mean, you're still paying for it, though the rate that is being charged just increases to residents. And those drop-off stations are, we'll call them drop-off stations, typically in other communities. They are free of charge and usually unsupervised, but Y'all's Town is providing a premium service that has the kind of the the source separated material that is insured to go to the proper recycling location. You have the great customer service by the members of the public works staff, and there's a lot of additional responsibilities that come with that. So right now it is assumed in the slide that Jack has on the screen that those rates would still be applied, and that admin fee that's showed there in the leftmost bar of each graph is designed to make the collection center whole and kind of balance the existing budget of the collection center.
One follow-up, then I quit. So I assume everything you're picking up is trash, not recyclable.
For this study, we were focused on.
Okay, so there's no recycle pickup.
Correct. Not for residential.
Okay.
We did not analyze commercial.
Okay, so yeah.
Vice Mayor.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you're fine. Finish, and then I have a few things I'd like to say.
So yeah, this doesn't include commercial at all. It's strictly residential.
Correct. Yeah, in Arizona, just to do a level there, exclusive commercial servicing is prohibited. So it has to stay open market. So we did residential waste or trash collection only as part of this study. No feasibility for recycling, bulk pickup, or any of that, and nothing commercial. And nothing over, Philip, correct me if I'm wrong, multifamily, which was 4 units or more?
Yeah, so those would still assume to be commercial service.
Commercial, okay.
Yeah, so we went 4 units or less.
All right.
Was residential.
That's 4 units or more on the same piece of property.
Yes. Yeah, same piece of property. Is that right, Philip?
Yeah, it's
like same service.
These are all like the single family or the duplex types homes. Nothing that would be typically considered multifamily.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, first off, I just want to thank Jack and Philip. They have been great partners to work with, and we've spent a significant amount of time trying to get all of this put together for you guys. So I feel like we came with a very comprehensive overlook. I know that there's a lot of little pieces that each one of you are concerned about, and I think that they all have concerns that we'll have to talk about. My intentions is the next step would be come January or February when we start the budget stuff, we would take some time out of the budget sessions to talk about this matter. That's what my intentions were. I'm sorry I couldn't be here tonight, or I would have explained that to you at the beginning. So we can look at more details and how we want to go forward. The second thing I would like to bring up is I just wanted to reiterate, Jerry, that the annexation area, the east one, we were looking at only 30% of them actually being part of that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Philip, but I believe that our
the east one, yeah, it was 30%, I think it was.
Yeah, that's
partial occupancy.
So it's a very little piece that they would be adding to the actual overall. So I'm sure that I could get, we could run some more numbers on if those pieces weren't connected. So we can look at that at the budget session as well. The last thing is that this is not an easy choice for any of you, and it comes with a lot of thought, and that's why I wanted to do it in December. Is I wanted to give you guys the time to actually think about what direction the town really needs to go in, and so I'm hoping that this will give you enough time to really think about it, and that we can come up with a solid plan come budget season on what we're moving forward with and what direction we'll go with. So that's my intentions. Thank you, Vice Mayor.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if is the mayor back on or anybody? Okay. All right, well, thank you very much, Mr. Simmons. We appreciate it, and obviously we'll have more discussions on this. So.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Lastly, let me just throw out a couple upcoming events. Tomorrow is the Mayor's Tree Lighting at Jack Barker Park, and that begins at 5:30, although some of the information says 5 that's out there in the community. But the mayor will actually do the tree lighting at 6 o'clock tomorrow. Saturday also is the flag ceremony for Pearl Harbor Day here at 11 o'clock. And then the Wreath Across America flag ceremony will be December 14th at 11 o'clock here also, after which is when they go to the cemeteries to place the wreaths. So just some upcoming events there. If there's no further questions, this meeting is adjourned.